In the harsh winter of 1893, when the snow fell thick across the Colorado Territory, a young Chinese woman named Mei Chen sat in the back room of her uncle's laundry, her beautiful black hair scattered across the wooden floor like broken promises. Her tears had long since dried, but the shame burned fresh as morning frost. She had refused the marriage her family arranged, and they had taken the one thing that marked her as a woman of worth. What she didn't know was that 60 miles away, a lonely rancher named Samuel Hayes was about to make a decision that would change both their lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The territory of Colorado in 1893 was a place where winter came early and stayed long, where the wind carried stories of broken dreams and the promise of new beginnings. In the small mining town of Silver Falls, nestled between towering peaks that scraped the belly of gray clouds, the Chinese Quarter occupied 3 narrow streets behind the main thoroughfare. Here the smell of steamed rice mixed with the sharp bite of lye soap from the laundries, and conversations flowed in Cantonese between wooden buildings that leaned against each other like old friends sharing secrets. Mei Chen had lived in this world for 18 years, ever since her parents had sent her across the ocean to live with her uncle's family. She was not like the other Chinese girls who kept their eyes downcast and their voices soft. At 22, Mei moved through Uncle Chen's laundry with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to navigate between two worlds, the traditional expectations of her heritage and the wild possibilities of the American frontier. Her hands, though small, were strong from years of scrubbing shirts stained with mine dust and cattle blood. Her back was straight from carrying heavy baskets of wet clothes to the drying lines that stretched between buildings like spiderwebs catching morning dew. But it was her eyes that set her apart. Dark and intelligent, they held a spark that refused to be dimmed by the endless cycle of wash, rinse and repeat that defined most women's lives in Silver Falls. The laundry occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building that Uncle Chen had purchased, with savings earned through 15 years of careful work. The front room held the washing tubs, great wooden barrels that steamed in winter and collected flies in summer. Behind that was the pressing room, where heavy irons heated over coal stoves pressed wrinkles from miners' shirts and ranchers' pants. In the very back, separated by a curtain made from flour sacks, was the mending room, where Mei spent her quietest hours. This was where she felt most herself, surrounded by baskets of torn clothes that needed her careful attention. She had learned to sew from her aunt, but her skill had surpassed her teacher years ago. Miners would bring her shirts ripped by rockfalls, and she would repair them so skillfully that the men's were stronger than the original fabric. Ranch hands brought leather chaps split by barbed wire, and her careful stitches would make them whole again. But it was the delicate work that truly showcased her talent. When the banker's wife needed her Sunday dress taken in after a long illness, it was Mei who adjusted every seam with such precision that the dress looked newly made. When the preacher's daughter tore her wedding gown 3 days before her ceremony, Mei worked through the night by lamplight, her needle moving like a dancer. Through silk and lace until the tear vanished completely. Uncle Chen recognized her skill, but he also worried about her independence. In his mind, a young woman of good family should be married and running her own household, not spending her days among other people's dirty laundry. He had come to America to build a better life for his family, but that life still followed the patterns he had learned in Guangdong province, patterns that had governed his people for 1,000 years. The marriage proposal had come from the Wong family in Denver. Their son, David Wong, was a successful merchant who owned 2 general stores and was looking for a wife who understood both Chinese customs and American business. On paper, it was an excellent match. David was educated, prosperous, and respected. In the Chinese community, He had even been born in America, which would ensure that May's children would never face the questions about belonging that haunted so many immigrant families. Uncle Chen had presented the proposal with pride, laying out the advantages like a merchant displaying his finest goods. David Wong would provide a good home, financial security, and the respect that came with being a successful merchant's wife. May would move to Denver, a real city with paved streets and electric lights, where she could join the ladies' auxiliary at the Chinese Methodist Church and raise children who would never know the rough edges of frontier life. But when May had looked at the photograph of David Wong, a stern-faced man in a stiff collar with eyes that seemed to calculate her worth, she had felt something inside her recoil, like a horse shying from a snake. This was not revulsion toward the man himself, whom she had never met, but toward the life the marriage represented. It was a life lived in careful steps within carefully drawn lines, a life where her needle would mend only her own family's clothes, and her voice would be heard only within the walls of her own home. Her refusal had shocked Uncle Chen into silence. Aunt Chen had wept, not from sadness, but from the fear that her niece was throwing away her one chance at respectability. The other women in the Chinese quarter had whispered behind their hands, some with sympathy for a girl who didn't understand her good fortune, others with envy that she had the luxury of choice. But May's refusal had not been born from luxury or ignorance. It had come from something deeper, a certainty that lived in her bones like winter cold. She had watched the married women in Silver Falls, both Chinese and white, and she had seen how marriage changed them. The light in their eyes dimmed as they poured their energy into other people's needs. Their hands, which had once created beautiful things, became tools for endless maintenance, cooking, cleaning, mending, managing. She did not want to disappear into someone else's life, no matter how comfortable that life might be. She had dreams that extended beyond the walls of any household, no matter how prosperous. In the quiet hours after the laundry closed, she had taught herself to read English by studying the newspapers that wrapped the clean clothes. She had learned about the world beyond Silver Falls, about women in the East who were opening their own businesses, becoming teachers and writers and even doctors. The punishment had come swiftly. Uncle Chen, embarrassed by having to withdraw the marriage proposal, had declared that if May would not behave as a proper Chinese daughter, she would not be allowed to look like one. In Chinese culture, a woman's hair was her crown, her beauty, her identity. Long black hair, carefully braided and pinned, marked her as feminine and valuable. The cutting had been done by Aunt Chen with kitchen shears, her hands shaking with anger and shame. Each snip had echoed in the small back room like the sound of doors closing. When it was finished, May's hair hung in rough, uneven chunks just below her ears. She looked like a boy, or worse, like a woman who had been marked as unfit for decent society. The humiliation was meant to break her spirit, to make her so desperate for acceptance that she would beg forgiveness and agree to any marriage arrangement. But as May sat in the mending room that cold December morning, running her fingers through what remained of her hair, she felt not defeat, but a strange kind of freedom. The weight was gone from her shoulders, both literally and figuratively. She was no longer bound by the expectations that came with being a beautiful Chinese daughter ready for marriage. Outside the small window, snow fell steadily on Silver Falls, covering the rough edges of the mining town with pristine white. The mountains stood like sentinels, their peaks disappearing into low-hanging clouds. Somewhere out there, beyond the Chinese quarter and the main street and the mines that carved wealth from stone, was a larger world where a woman might make her own way. But for now, May was trapped in the back room of a laundry, her disgrace, hidden from customers who might be scandalized by her appearance. Uncle Chen had made it clear that she could not work in the front rooms until her hair grew back to a respectable length. She was to stay hidden, doing the mending work that no one would see, until she came to her senses and accepted her proper place in the world. The isolation gave her time to think, but it also gave her time to plan. She had a small amount of money saved from the extra work she did, mending for customers who paid her directly rather than going through Uncle Chen. It wasn't much, but it was enough to survive for a while if she lived carefully. The question was where to go and how to support herself in a world that offered few opportunities for a young Chinese woman, especially one marked by the visible sign of family disgrace. As she worked on a torn coat that morning, her fingers automatically finding the rhythm of repair, May let her mind wander to the stories she had heard about the ranches that spread across the valleys beyond Silver Falls. She had mended clothes. Her ranch hands, who came to town for supplies, and their garments told stories of a life lived under open skies. Their shirts bore the stains of honest sweat and wind-driven dust. Their pants showed the wear patterns of men who spent their days on horseback, moving cattle across endless grasslands. It was a hard life, she knew, but it was also a life where people were judged by their work rather than their family connections. On the frontier, competence mattered more than convention. A person who could do needed work would find a place, regardless of their background or the circumstances that had brought them there. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. May had lived her entire American life within the protective boundaries of the Chinese Quarter, where everyone understood the rules and expectations even when they chafed against them. To venture beyond that protection into the wider world of the Colorado Territory would be like stepping off the edge of a known map into territory marked only with warnings about dragons. But as she sat in that back room, her chopped hair hidden under a scarf, her future narrowed to whatever marriage Uncle Chen might eventually arrange out of necessity rather than pride, the unknown began to seem less frightening than the alternative. At least in the wilderness, her fate would be in her own hands. The morning stretched on, marked by the familiar sounds of the laundry, the splash of water in washing tubs, the hiss of steam from pressing irons, the murmur of conversations in Cantonese. Customers came and went, their voices filtering through the flour sack curtain that separated May from the world she had once been part of. Some asked about her, having grown accustomed to her careful mending work. Uncle Chen explained that she was ill, would be back soon, the lie rolling off his tongue with the smooth ease of a man protecting his family's reputation. By afternoon, the snow had stopped, but the sky remained heavy and grey, pressing down on the town like a lid on a pot. May finished the coat she had been working on and reached for the next item in the mending basket, a shirt that had been torn nearly in half, probably by a mining accident. As she examined the damage, planning how to repair it properly, she heard Uncle Chen's voice in the front room, speaking in the careful English he used with white customers. "Yes, sir, we can have ready by Friday. May is very good with difficult repairs, but she is not feeling well today. Can work tomorrow, have it ready very soon." The customer's voice was unfamiliar, deeper than the usual miners and merchants who frequented the laundry. "I appreciate that. This is my best work shirt, and I need it mended proper, not just patched. I hear your niece does fine work." "Oh yes, sir, very fine work. She learned from her aunt, but now is even better than her aunt. You bring back Friday afternoon, will be like new." May felt a small stab of irony. Even in disgrace, hidden away like a shameful secret, her reputation for quality work continued to bring customers to the family business. Uncle Chen could hide her from sight, but he could not hide from the fact that her skills were essential to the laundry's success. It was a small consolation, but it was something. As the afternoon wore on and the light began to fail, May lit the oil lamp that hung above her work table. The familiar tasks of mending were soothing, requiring just enough concentration to quiet the worried voices in her head while leaving room for her mind to wander. She found herself thinking about the rancher whose shirt she would repair, wondering what kind of work had torn it so badly, what kind of life he lived out there, under the big sky. She had never been on a ranch, had barely been outside Silver Falls except for occasional trips to buy supplies in neighboring towns. But she had imagination, fed by the stories she gleaned from overheard conversations and the evidence left behind in torn and stained clothing. She pictured vast grasslands stretching to the horizon, herds of cattle moving like living clouds across the landscape, and men who measured their wealth in land and livestock rather than gold pulled from the ground. It was a different kind of life from what she had known, and certainly different from what Uncle Chen had planned for her. But as she worked by lamplight in the back room of the laundry, her own plans began to take shape. She would not wait for her hair to grow back. She would not submit to another marriage arrangement. When spring came and travel became easier, she would find a way to leave Silver Falls and make her own path in the world. The decision felt both terrifying and liberating, like cutting through the last threads that bound her to a life she had never chosen. Tomorrow, she would begin preparing for that journey. But tonight she would finish mending the rancher's shirt, putting her whole heart into the work as if it were a prayer for the life she hoped to build with her own 2 hands. 3 days passed before Samuel Hayes returned to Silver Falls. The storm that had been threatening finally broke on Thursday night, dumping 2 feet of fresh snow across the Colorado Territory and making the mountain roads treacherous for anyone foolish enough to attempt them. By Friday afternoon, the sun had emerged, turning the snow-covered town into a glittering landscape that hurt to look at directly. Samuel guided his horse carefully down the main street, noting how the storm had changed the familiar landmarks. The general store's sign was barely visible above a drift that reached nearly to the second-story windows. The blacksmith's forge sent up a column of black smoke that stood perfectly straight in the still air, and the sound of his hammer rang, clear and sharp in the cold. At 35, Samuel Hayes had the weathered look of a man who had spent 20 years working under the Colorado sun and wind. His hands, large and scarred from rope burns and barbed wire, held the reins with the easy confidence of someone who had been riding since childhood. His shoulders were broad beneath a wool coat that had seen many winters, and his boots were the practical kind favored by men who valued function over appearance. But it was his eyes that would have surprised those who knew him only by reputation. Grey as winter sky, they held a gentleness that seemed at odds with his size, and the stories told about his ability to handle difficult horses and stubborn cattle. Those eyes had seen too much loneliness, too many empty evenings in a house built for a family, but occupied by just one man. The Broken Arrow Ranch lay 40 miles northeast of Silver Falls, a spread of 15,000 acres that Samuel had built from nothing over the course of 15 years. He had come to Colorado as a young man, with little more than a horse, a saddle, and the kind of stubborn determination that the territory seemed to breed in its settlers. Through careful management, hard work, and more than a little luck, he had turned that initial claim into one of the most successful ranches in the region. The success had come at a cost. While other men his age were raising families and building legacies for their children, Samuel had poured all his energy into the land and the cattle. He told himself it was enough, that the satisfaction of building something lasting with his own hands was worth the sacrifice. But on winter nights, when the wind howled around his empty house, he felt the weight of his solitude like a physical thing pressing against his chest. He had tried marriage once to a schoolteacher from Denver who had seemed charmed by the romantic idea of life on a ranch. Sarah had lasted 8 months before the isolation and the hard work broke her spirit and sent her back to the city. She had been kind in her leaving, explaining that she had expected ranch life to be like the dime novels she read, full of adventure and noble cowboys. The reality of endless chores, brutal weather, and weeks without seeing another woman had been more than she could bear. Since then, Samuel had convinced himself that he was better suited to bachelor life. He was set in his ways, comfortable with his routines, and free to make decisions based purely on what was best for the ranch. But lately, as he approached 40, he had begun to feel the limitations of a life lived entirely for oneself. The ranch would die with him unless he found someone to share the burden and the legacy he had spent his life building. The problem was finding the right kind of woman. The frontier attracted certain types: the adventurous, the desperate, the running away from something. But it also demanded a toughness that many women, raised in gentler circumstances, simply did not possess. Samuel needed someone who could see beauty in harsh landscapes, find satisfaction in hard work, and understand that love on the frontier was often expressed through practical care rather than romantic gestures. He had been thinking about these things more often lately, especially since his foreman had gotten married and moved his new wife into the small cabin near the barn. Watching Jake and Martha work together, seeing how they shared both the burdens and the joys of ranch life, had awakened something in Samuel that he had thought permanently buried after Sarah's departure. The Chinese laundry occupied a narrow building squeezed between a cobbler's shop and a store that sold mining supplies. Samuel had been bringing his mending here for 3 years, ever since Mrs. Patterson had grown too old to do the delicate work his torn shirts required. The quality of the repairs had impressed him. Each mend was done with such skill that the repaired areas were often stronger than the original fabric. He tied his horse to the hitching post outside and pushed through. The door, setting the bell above it jingling. The warmth hit him immediately, humid and scented with soap and starch. Chen Wei looked up from a pressing iron with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mr. Hayes, good afternoon. Your shirt, it is ready. Very good work, like new. Samuel nodded his thanks, but before Chen could disappear into the back room, he held up a hand. Actually, I'd like to speak with your niece about the work. That tier was tricky, and I want to make sure she knows how much I appreciate the quality. Chen's smile faltered slightly. Oh, my niece. She is still not feeling well. Very sorry, but she cannot come to the front today. Maybe next time when she feel better. But Samuel had caught something in the older man's voice, a tension that suggested more than simple illness. He had dealt with enough people in his years of buying and selling cattle to recognize when someone was not telling the complete truth. I hope it's nothing serious. She does beautiful work. Be ashamed to lose a skill like that. No, not serious. She will be fine soon. Chen disappeared into the back room and returned with the shirt, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Here, very good repair. You see, like new. Samuel accepted the package, but made no move to leave. Instead, he looked around the laundry with the appraising eye of a man accustomed to evaluating businesses. The equipment was well maintained, the workspace organized, but he noticed signs of strain, clothing piled higher than usual, pressing work backed up on the tables. Seems like you could use some help around here, he observed. Business looks good, maybe too good for just 2 people to handle. Chen's laugh sounded forced. We manage fine. Always busy in winter. People need clean clothes, warm clothes. We manage. Samuel unwrapped a corner of the package and examined the repair to his shirt. The tear that had run nearly from collar to hem had been mended with tiny, precise stitches that followed the original weave of the fabric so closely they were barely visible. The edges had been reinforced with additional fabric that matched the original so perfectly it might have been cut from the same bolt. This is exceptional work, he said, running his thumb along the repair. Your niece has real talent. I've got more mending that needs this kind of skill, and I'd be willing to pay extra for quality like this. Chen's discomfort was becoming more obvious by the moment. He shifted his weight from foot to foot and avoided meeting Samuel's eyes. "Very kind, Mr. Hayes, very kind. But my niece, she very busy, very much work already. Maybe you find someone else for extra work." Samuel studied the older man's face, noting the lines of worry and the way his hands trembled slightly as he folded and refolded a cloth that was already perfectly neat. In his experience, people only acted this nervous when they were protecting something important or someone they cared about. "Mr. Chen," he said quietly, "if there's some kind of trouble, maybe I could help. I know it's not my business, but I've lived in this territory long enough to know that sometimes good people need assistance, and sometimes it comes from unexpected places." For a moment, Chen's careful composure cracked, and Samuel saw the genuine distress underneath. The older man glanced toward the flour sack curtain that separated the front room from the back, then looked at Samuel with the desperate expression of a man running out of options. "My niece," he said finally, "she make big mistake. Bring shame to family. Now she cannot work in front, cannot show face to customers. Very difficult situation." Samuel waited, sensing that there was more to the story. In his experience, people would usually fill silence with truth if given enough time and patience. "She refused good marriage," Chen continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Good family, good man, very respectable. But she say no, bring disgrace to our name. Now," he gestured helplessly toward the back room, "now she cannot marry anyone. No one will want her after such disrespect." Samuel felt a stirring of interest that had nothing to do with torn shirts or laundry services. A woman with enough courage to refuse an unwanted marriage was a woman with backbone, the kind of strength that might survive the challenges of frontier life. "May I ask why she refused?" Chen looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "She say she's not ready, say she have other ideas. But what other ideas? She is a woman, good family, good chance for marriage. What else is there?" Samuel could think of several answers to that question, but he kept them to himself for the moment. Instead, he said, "Would it be possible to speak with her? Not about marriage," he added quickly, seeing the alarm in Chen's eyes. "About work. I have a proposition that might interest her." "What kind of proposition?" The voice came from behind the flour sack curtain, clear and strong despite being slightly muffled. Chen's eyes widened in horror, but Samuel felt a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "May!" Chen hissed in Cantonese, but the curtain was already moving aside. The young woman who stepped into the front room was not what Samuel had expected. Her hair had been roughly cut, hanging in uneven chunks that spoke of hasty work done in anger rather than artistry. A scarf covered most of the damage, but enough showed to make the nature of her punishment clear. Her clothes were simple, a dark dress that had been mended in several places and a wool shawl that had seen many winters. But it was her eyes that captured Samuel's attention. Dark and intelligent, they met his gaze without flinching, holding a combination of defiance and curiosity that reminded him of a wild horse, wary but not afraid, ready to bolt but willing to listen. "You said you had work," she said, ignoring her uncle's sputtered protests. "What kind of work?" Samuel found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about Chinese women. The few he had encountered in town had seemed quiet and deferential, keeping their eyes downcast and speaking only when spoken to. This woman stood straight as a lodgepole pine and looked him in the eye like an equal. "I need someone with your skills," he said. "But not here in town. I've got a ranch 40 miles, northeast, and I need someone who can handle all kinds of mending and sewing. Work clothes, household linens, harness repair, that kind of thing. It's not easy work, and it's isolated, but it pays well." May stepped further into the room, and Samuel could see her uncle's distress growing with each word. "What kind of pay?" "Room, a board, and $30 a month, plus materials for any work you do on the side." Chen made a strangled sound, In the Chinese quarter, a skilled seamstress might make $8 or $10 a month if she worked constantly. $30 was more than most men earned in the mines. "May, you cannot think about this," Chen said in English, clearly hoping to appeal to Samuel's sense of propriety. "She is a young woman, unmarried, cannot go to the ranch with a strange man, not proper, not safe." Samuel nodded, understanding the concern. "That's why I'd want to make the arrangement formal and legal. A contract signed by witnesses stating the terms clearly. She'd have her own quarters, completely separate from the main house. And my foreman and his wife live on the ranch too, so she wouldn't be alone with just me." May's eyes never left his face as he spoke. Samuel could see her weighing his words, evaluating not just the offer, but the man making it. He found himself hoping she would see something that convinced her to trust him, though he couldn't have said exactly why her opinion mattered so much. "Why me?" she asked. "You could find women in Denver or Colorado Springs who need work." It was a fair question, and Samuel took time to consider his answer. The truth was complicated, part practical need, part recognition of something kindred in her circumstances, part simple attraction to her obvious competence and courage. "Because your work is the best I've seen," he said finally, "and because you understand what it means to start over, to build something from nothing. The frontier is hard on people who expect things to be easy, but it rewards those who are willing to work for what they want." "And what makes you think I'm willing to work for what I want?" Samuel gestured toward the mended shirt in his hands. "Because you put your whole heart into repairing a stranger's torn clothes. Anyone who takes that much pride in their work, who strives for that level of perfection, even when no one is watching, has the kind of character that succeeds out here." May was quiet for a long moment, and Samuel could almost see her mind working through the implications of his offer. She would be leaving everything familiar, trading the limited safety of her uncle's disapproval for the unknown challenges of ranch life. But she would also be trading dependence for independence, shame for respect, and a future chosen by others, for one she could shape herself. "How long would the contract be for?" she asked. "1 year initially. After that, we could negotiate new terms if both parties are satisfied, and if I'm not satisfied. If the work doesn't suit me, or the arrangements aren't what you promise." Samuel appreciated her caution. It showed intelligence and self-preservation, qualities that would serve her well in any circumstances. "Then you'd be free to leave with full pay for time worked and transportation back to town. I'm not looking for an indentured servant. I'm looking for someone who chooses to stay because the arrangement works for both of us." Chen had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation. "May, you must think carefully. This is not the proper Chinese way. What will people say? What will family in China think?" May turned to her uncle with an expression that was both loving and implacable. "Uncle, the proper Chinese way has already failed me. I cannot marry the man you chose, and now no respectable Chinese family will consider me suitable for their sons. What is left for me here? To hide in the back room until my hair grows out, then hope you can find some desperate widower who needs a housekeeper more than a wife." Her words were quiet, but filled with a pain that made Samuel's chest tighten. He recognized the sound of a spirit breaking free from constraints that had become unbearable, and he understood that his offer had arrived at exactly the moment when she was ready to risk everything for the chance at something better. "At least on the ranch," May continued, "my work would be valued for what it is, not diminished by what I am not, and I would be earning my own way, not depending on charity or the grudging tolerance of relatives who see me as a burden." Chen's shoulders sagged in defeat. "You are not burdened, child. But if you do this thing, if you go with stranger to live like white woman, there is no coming back. Chinese community will not accept you again." "Then I will build a new community," May said simply. one that values what I can contribute rather than punishing me for what I cannot become. Samuel felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than business arrangements or practical need. Here was a woman who understood the cost of choosing her own path and was willing to pay it. Here was someone who might understand why he had spent 20 years building something in the wilderness, why he had chosen the hard satisfaction of independent work over the easier comforts of conventional life. "When would you need an answer?" May asked, turning back to him. "Take whatever time you need," Samuel said, "but if you decide to accept, we'd need to travel before the next storm hits. The mountain roads get impassable quickly this time of year." May nodded, then disappeared back behind the flour sack curtain without another word. Samuel could hear her moving around in the back room, and he suspected she was examining her small collection of possessions, mentally cataloguing what she could take and what she would have to leave behind. Chen stood in the front room, looking like a man watching his world collapse. "Mr. Hayes," he said finally, "you seem a good man, honest man, but you do not understand what you ask. Chinese girl, she does not like white woman. She need protection, need family, need proper marriage. Alone on the ranch, what will happen to her?" Samuel considered the question seriously. It was true that he didn't fully understand the cultural forces that had shaped May's life, just as she probably didn't understand the realities of ranch work and frontier isolation. But he had seen enough of life to know that courage and adaptability were more important than cultural background when it came to surviving in difficult circumstances. "What happens to her if she stays here?" he asked quietly. "You said yourself that no respectable family will consider her now. So she stays hidden, unmarried, doing piecework in your back room until you die, and she has no one left to protect her at all. Is that better?" Chen had no answer for that, because they both knew it was the truth. In cutting May's hair, her family had marked her as damaged goods in the marriage market that defined a Chinese woman's worth. They had acted out of anger and disappointment, but they had also trapped her in a situation with no good outcomes. Within the traditional framework, "At least," Samuel continued, "if she comes to work for me, she'll be building skills and saving money that could give her real choices in the future. She could start her own sewing business, buy her own land, maybe even find someone who values her for her abilities rather than her conformity to other people's expectations." The bell above the door jingled as another customer entered, a miner with a coat that needed patching. Chen moved to help him, falling back into the familiar rhythms of business, but Samuel could see that their conversation had planted seeds that would continue growing. Samuel waited while Chen dealt with the customer, using the time to study his surroundings and think about what he was really offering. The practical benefits were clear. He genuinely needed someone with May's skills, and she needed work that would pay enough to secure her independence. But there was more to it than that, something that had to do with the way she had looked. Him in the eye without flinching, the quiet strength in her voice when she talked about building a new community. When the customer left, Chen returned to the conversation with obvious reluctance. "If she decide to go," he said, "what guarantee you will treat her with respect? What prevents you from taking advantage of young woman far from family?" It was a fair question, and Samuel appreciated that Chen was asking it. A man who didn't worry about such things wouldn't be worth trusting with anyone's welfare. "The contract will spell out all terms clearly," he said, "and I'll post a bond with the bank here in town, money that I forfeit if I don't live up to my agreements. Your niece will have the means to leave if she chooses, and she'll have legal recourse if I break my word. And what about marriage? You are an unmarried man. She is an unmarried woman. If you decide you want more than a seamstress, what then?" Samuel felt heat rise in his face, but he kept his voice level. "If something like that were to develop, it would have to be by her choice, not mine. I'm offering employment, not courtship. What happens beyond that would depend on two people getting to know each other and deciding they wanted something more. Chen studied his face for a long moment, clearly trying to read his intentions. Samuel let him look, knowing that his reputation in the community was solid enough to bear scrutiny. He had never been known as a man who took advantage of vulnerable people, and his word was accepted without question when it came to business dealings. "You have children?" Chen asked suddenly. The question caught Samuel off guard. "No, never been married long enough for that to happen." "But you want children? Want a family?" Samuel wasn't sure where this line of questioning was leading, but he answered honestly, "Someday, maybe, if I found the right woman, someone who could be a real partner in building something lasting. But that's not why I'm making this offer." Chen nodded slowly, and Samuel sensed that he had passed some kind of test. Chinese people, we think about family differently than white people. We think about honor, about taking care of each other, about building something that lasts for generations. May she think like American now, think about individual choice, individual success. Maybe that is good thing for her. Maybe that is what she need to survive in this place. But it is hard for old man to watch young woman choose a path with no family at end of it. Who says there's no family at the end of it? Samuel asked. Maybe she'll find a different kind of family. One that values what she brings, rather than trying to change her into something she's not. Before Chen could respond, the flour sack curtain moved aside again, and May stepped into the front room. She had removed the scarf, revealing the full extent of her cropped hair, and Samuel noticed that she had changed into what were probably her best clothes. A dark blue dress that had been carefully mended, and a coat that had seen many winters, but was clean and well-maintained. "I have some questions about the work," she said without preamble. "What kind of household linens would I be responsible for, and how much harness repair? I've done some leather work, but I'm not as skilled with it as I am with fabric." Samuel felt a surge of admiration for her practical approach. Instead of getting caught up in the emotional and cultural implications of the decision, she was focusing on the concrete details that would determine whether she could succeed in the job. "Mostly basic mending and maintenance," he said. "Sheets, towels, curtains, that kind of thing. The harness work would be simple repairs, replacing torn straps, reinforcing weak spots. Nothing too complicated. And I could teach you what you don't already know. What about clothing for the household? Would I be expected to make new garments or just repair existing ones? Whatever you're comfortable with. I can buy ready-made clothes in town, but if you wanted to take on more complex work, the pay would reflect that." May nodded, clearly calculating the potential income in her head. "And the living quarters? You mentioned they would be separate from the main house." "There's a small cabin about 100 yards from the main house. It's got a stove, a bed, a table, and a chair. Basic, but comfortable. In summer, you could have a garden if you wanted one." "What about winter? How often would I be completely cut off from town?" Samuel appreciated that she was thinking ahead to the practical challenges of frontier isolation. "Depends on the weather. In a bad winter, we might go 6 or 8 weeks without making it to town. But we keep plenty of supplies on hand, and there's always plenty of work to keep occupied. And if I got sick or injured, is there medical care available? My foreman's wife has some medical training. She's delivered babies and treated injuries. For anything serious, we'd get you to the doctor in town, weather permitting. It's not perfect, but it's no worse than most places out here." May was quiet for a moment, and Samuel could see her mentally weighing all the information he had given her. Finally, she said, "I want to see the contract terms in writing before I decide." "Fair enough." Samuel pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "I wrote up the basic terms while I was waiting for the storm to clear. You can read it over and suggest any changes." May accepted the paper and unfolded it, her eyes scanning the neat handwriting. Samuel watched her face as she read, noting the slight frown that indicated careful consideration rather than confusion. When she finished, she looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. "This is generous," she said. "More generous than it needs to be for the work described. Why?" It was a question Samuel had been expecting, and one he had been asking himself. The truth was complex, involving his growing need for companionship, his recognition of her courage, and his sense that they might be able to build something meaningful together. But he wasn't ready to voice all of that, especially not in front of her uncle. "Because good work deserves good pay," he said. "And because I think you'll bring more to the job than just sewing skills. You'll bring intelligence, attention to detail, and the kind of pride in your work that makes everything better." May folded the contract carefully and handed it back to him. "I need 1 day to think about it and to make arrangements if I decide to accept." "Of course. I'll be staying at the hotel tonight. You can find me there tomorrow morning with your—" And Sir May nodded and disappeared back behind the curtain, leaving Samuel alone with Chen, who looked like a man watching his daughter walk into a burning building. "You think you do good thing," Chen said quietly, "but you do not know what you ask of her, what you ask of me. If she go with you, I lose face in the Chinese community. People say I cannot control my own family, cannot keep young women safe and proper." Samuel felt sympathy for the older man's position, but he also understood that May's current situation offered no real solutions within the traditional framework. Sometimes keeping someone safe means letting them choose their own risks, he said, and sometimes the most proper thing is to let a person use their talents in the way that serves them best. Chen shook his head sadly. "American way of thinking may be good for Americans, but very hard for Chinese family." Samuel left the laundry with more questions than answers, but with a growing sense that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. As he walked through the snow-covered streets of Silver Falls, he found himself hoping that May Chen would find the courage to take the leap into an uncertain but promising future. He also found himself hoping that he would prove worthy of the trust she would be placing in him. The hotel room at the Silver Falls Inn was small and sparse, furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair positioned near the frost-covered window. Samuel Hayes sat in that chair as dawn broke over the mountains, watching the town come alive in the grey morning light. Smoke began rising from chimneys, and the first early risers emerged to shovel paths through yesterday's snow. He had slept poorly, his mind churning through the implications of what he had offered. In the cold light of morning, the proposition seemed simultaneously reasonable and completely mad. He was asking a young Chinese woman to abandon everything familiar and trust her future to a stranger who lived 40 miles from the nearest neighbor. When he put it in those terms, he couldn't imagine why anyone would accept such an arrangement, but he also couldn't forget the way May Chen had looked him in the eye when she asked about the work, the practical intelligence in her questions about contracts and living conditions. She wasn't a naive girl, swept away by romantic notions of ranch life. She was a woman calculating her options with the clear-eyed pragmatism of someone who had already learned that life rarely offered perfect choices. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. Samuel opened it to find a boy of perhaps 12, bundled in a coat too large for his thin frame. The child held out a folded piece of paper with mittened hands. "For Mr. Hayes," the boy said in accented English, "from Chen Laundry." Samuel pressed a coin into the boy's palm and watched him scurry back down the hallway before unfolding the note. The handwriting was precise and feminine, each letter carefully formed. "Mr. Hayes, I have decided to accept your offer, but I have additional terms to propose. Can you meet me at the church at 9 o'clock this morning? We can discuss the details with Reverend Morrison as witness. Monsieur Chen." Samuel checked his pocket watch. 8:15. Enough time to shave, dress properly, and walk to the small white church that served Silver Falls' Protestant community. The suggestion to meet there rather than at the laundry showed careful thought. A neutral location with a respected witness present would lend legitimacy to their negotiations and protect both parties from gossip about improper meetings. The church sat at the end of Main Street, its simple spire pointing toward peaks that caught the early morning sun like broken glass. Samuel arrived a few minutes early and found Reverend Morrison already waiting, a tall man with kind eyes and prematurely grey hair who had been ministering to the spiritual needs of miners, ranchers, and townspeople for nearly a decade. "Mr. Hayes," the Reverend said, extending his hand. "Miss Chen explained that you needed a witness for some business arrangements. She's quite a remarkable young woman. Her English is better than most of my parishioners who were born here." "She's certainly impressive," Samuel agreed. "I hope we can work out terms that serve both our needs." "Well, here she comes now. We'll soon find out." Samuel turned to see May approaching the church with measured steps. She had braided what remained of her hair and pinned it close to her head in a style that was practical rather than fashionable. Her coat was dark wool, carefully mended but obviously old, and she carried a small leather satchel that probably contained her few valuable possessions. Most striking was her composure. Despite making a decision that would change everything about her life, she walked with the steady confidence of someone who had weighed all options and chosen the best available path forward. Samuel found himself thinking that this was exactly the kind of strength that succeeded on the frontier, not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear dictate choices. "Gentlemen," she said with a slight nod as she reached them, "thank you for agreeing to meet here, Reverend Morrison. I believe having a witness will make this arrangement more proper for everyone involved." "Of course, my dear. Shall we go inside, where it's warmer?" The interior of the church was simple but well-maintained, with wooden pews arranged before a plain altar. Sunlight streamed through clear glass windows, creating patterns on the floor that shifted as clouds moved across the sky. The three of them settled into the front pew, with Reverend Morrison between Samuel and May. "Now then," the Reverend said, "Miss Chen tells me you're offering her employment at your ranch, Mr. Hayes. She wanted to discuss terms with proper oversight, to ensure everything is above board and fair to both parties." Samuel nodded and withdrew the contract from his coat pocket. "I've written up basic terms, but Miss Chen mentioned she had additional proposals." May reached into her satchel and produced a sheet of paper covered with neat handwriting. "I spent considerable time last night thinking through all aspects of this arrangement. While I appreciate your generous offer, I believe certain modifications would better protect both our interests." She unfolded her paper and consulted it as she spoke. "First, regarding the trial period. You mentioned 1 year, but I propose we establish checkpoints every 3 months, where either party can evaluate the arrangement and request modifications or terminate the contract with 2 weeks' notice." Samuel considered this. It was actually more flexible than his original proposal, allowing for adjustments as they learned what worked and what didn't. "That seems reasonable. What else?" "Second, regarding my living quarters, you mentioned a cabin, but I would like specific assurance that I will have privacy and security, a lock on the door that only I control, and a guarantee that no one enters without my explicit permission except in cases of emergency." Reverend Morrison nodded approvingly. "Very sensible, Miss Chen. A young woman living independently needs such assurances." "Absolutely," Samuel agreed. "I should have thought to include that in the original contract." May made a small mark on her paper with a pencil stub. "Third, I would like to establish my right to take on additional sewing work for other customers, provided it doesn't interfere with my ranch duties. Any income from such work would be mine to keep." This was also reasonable, and Samuel realized it showed business acumen that would serve her well, regardless of how long she stayed at the ranch. Agreed, as long as ranch work takes priority during busy seasons. Fourth, May continued, I want a clear understanding about social arrangements. I will attend community gatherings if invited and if I choose to do so, but I should not be expected to represent myself as anything other than your employee. No implications of courtship or marriage unless such a relationship develops naturally and is desired by both parties. Samuel felt heat rise in his face. The Reverend cleared his throat. Delicately. This was the most delicate aspect of the arrangement, the unspoken possibility that had made Uncle Chen so uncomfortable. Miss Chen, Samuel said carefully, I want to be completely clear about this. I offered you employment because I need someone with your skills, not because I was looking for a wife. If friendship or anything more were to develop between us, it would have to grow naturally over time, and it would never affect your job security or your right to leave if you chose to do so. And if I were to meet someone else, May said with the practical directness he was beginning to appreciate, someone I wished to marry, you would not consider that a breach of contract or attempt to interfere? Of course not. Your personal life is your own business, as long as it doesn't prevent you from fulfilling your work obligations. May made another mark on her paper. Fifth, I want assurance about medical care and emergency transportation. If I become seriously ill or injured, you will make every effort to get me to proper medical attention, regardless of weather or expense. Naturally, Samuel said. This was simply human decency, and he was slightly hurt that she felt the need to stipulate it. But then he realized that from her perspective, as a young woman with no family nearby and no legal protections beyond their contract, every detail needed to be explicitly stated. Sixth, she continued, I would like 1 day, off per week, weather permitting, to attend to personal business, correspondence, or simply rest. On Sundays, I will attend church services if I choose to do so, but I should not be required to attend any particular denomination. Reverend Morrison smiled. We'd welcome you at our services, Miss Chen, but the choice should certainly be yours. Agreed, Samuel said. Is there more? May consulted her list again. 2 final points. First, regarding payment. Instead of receiving all my wages monthly, I would like to have half sent directly to a bank account in my name, to ensure I'm building independent savings. The other half I'll take in cash for current expenses. This impressed Samuel even more than her previous requests. She was thinking beyond immediate survival to long-term financial security, planning for a future where she might need resources to start over again or pursue opportunities that didn't yet exist. The bank here in town can handle that arrangement, he said. It's actually a smart way to manage money, especially when you're living in isolated circumstances. And the final point? Reverend Morrison asked. May folded her list carefully before speaking. I want it understood that this arrangement is temporary by its nature. I am not accepting this position as a permanent life choice, but as a step toward building the skills and resources I need to eventually establish my own business or pursue other opportunities. You should not expect me to stay indefinitely, and I should not feel obligated to do so out of gratitude or guilt. The honesty of this statement was both refreshing and slightly disappointing. Samuel had been harboring hopes that if the arrangement worked well, May might choose to make it permanent, perhaps eventually as more than just an employee. But her directness about her intentions was also reassuring. She was entering the agreement with realistic expectations rather than romantic fantasies. I understand, he said, and I appreciate your honesty. It's better for both of us to know where we stand from the beginning. Reverend Morrison had been taking notes throughout their conversation. These all seem like reasonable modifications to the original proposal. Shall I draft a revised contract incorporating these terms? That would be very helpful, May said. I also have one personal request that's not part of the business arrangement. Samuel waited, curious about what else she might need. My uncle is very distressed about this decision. He sees it as abandoning Chinese customs and bringing shame to our family name. I was hoping, she paused, seeming to gather her courage. I was hoping you might speak with him. Explain that you understand the seriousness of employing someone from our community, and that you will treat me with respect due to a Chinese daughter. Samuel was touched by her concern for her uncle's feelings, even though the older man had treated her harshly. It showed a maturity and loyalty that spoke well of her character. Of course, he said, I should have thought to do that anyway. It's important that your family understands my intentions are honorable. Thank you. It won't change his opinion of my choice, but it might help him explain to others that you are a man of good character. Reverend Morrison finished writing and looked up from his notes. I think we have the framework for a very fair agreement. Miss Chen, you've shown remarkable foresight in thinking through these details. Mr. Hayes, your willingness to accept these modifications speaks well of your character and intentions. Samuel stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered town while he processed everything that had been discussed. In agreeing to May's terms, he was committing to more than just employing a seamstress. He was taking responsibility for the welfare of a young woman who was risking everything on his word and his ability to provide the opportunities he had promised. The weight of that responsibility was sobering, but it was also energizing. For the first time in years, he felt like he was building something that mattered beyond just the accumulation of land and cattle. He was potentially changing the course of someone's life, giving her the chance to become whatever she had the courage and ability to achieve. When would you like to leave for the ranch? He asked, turning back to face them. May considered this. How long will it take to prepare the revised contract? I can have it ready by this afternoon, Reverend Morrison said, and if we sign it today, you could leave tomorrow morning if the weather holds. That would work, May said. It gives me time to pack my belongings and say goodbye to my aunt and uncle properly. Samuel nodded. I'll need to pick up supplies for the winter anyway. We can load your things with the rest of the cargo. As they prepared to leave the church, Reverend Morrison placed a gentle hand on May's shoulder. Miss Chen, I want you to know that you'll always have friends here in Silver Falls. If circumstances change or you need assistance of any kind, please don't hesitate to reach out to this community. Thank you, Reverend. Your kindness means more than I can express. Samuel and May walked together toward the main street, their breath visible in the cold air. The sun had climbed higher, turning the snow from gray to brilliant white, and the town was fully awake now, with people going about their daily business. I should speak with your uncle now, Samuel said, as they approached the laundry. Would it be better if you introduced us formally, or should I go in alone? Come with me, May said. Uncle Chen will be more polite if I'm present, and Aunt Chen should hear this conversation too. The laundry was busy with the morning rush of customers dropping off clothes before work. Uncle Chen looked up as they entered, his face immediately clouding when he saw them together. He said something sharp in Cantonese to his wife, who emerged from the back room, wiping her hands on her apron. Uncle, Aunt, May said in English, Mr. Hayes would like to speak with you about the employment arrangement. Chen's jaw tightened, but he nodded to his other customers. Please wait a moment. Very sorry for the delay. When the last customer left, Chen turned to Samuel with the controlled politeness of a man doing his duty despite his personal feelings. Mr. Hayes, my niece tell me she accept your offer. I hope you understand what this mean for Chinese family. Samuel removed his hat and stood straight, meeting Chen's eyes with the respect due to an elder and the head of a household. Mr. Chen, Mrs. Chen, I want you to know that I understand the trust you're placing in me, and I don't take that responsibility lightly. Your niece will be treated with the same respect I would show my own sister. Sister is not the same as an employee, Chen said bluntly. Sister has family protection. Employee has only the employer's word. That's why we've drawn up a detailed contract with a reverend as witness, Samuel replied. Every term is spelled out clearly, including your niece's right to return here with full pay and transportation if she's not satisfied with the arrangement. Aunt Chen spoke for the first time, her English heavily accented but clear. What happen if she gets sick? If she have accident? Chinese girl, very far from family, what protection does she have? Samuel appreciated that both aunt and uncle were asking the hard questions that loving relatives should ask. Mrs. Chen, I give you my word that your niece will receive the best care available. My foreman's wife has medical training, and we'll get her to the doctor in town for anything serious, regardless of weather or cost. And what happen if you decide you want more than a seamstress? Chen asked with the directness Samuel was learning to expect from this family. Young man, young woman alone on ranch? What prevent you from taking advantage? First, Samuel said, your niece will have her own secure living quarters, completely separate from mine. Second, my foreman and his wife live on the ranch too, so she won't be alone with just me. Third, and most importantly, I was raised to believe that a man's word is the most valuable thing he possesses. I'm giving you my word that your niece will be safe under my protection. Chen studied Samuel's face for a long moment, then exchanged a rapid conversation in Cantonese with his wife. Samuel couldn't understand the words, but he could read the emotions, worry, resignation, and perhaps a grudging respect for his directness. Finally, Chen nodded slowly. You seem an honest man, Mr. Hayes, but if you break a promise, if you harm May in any way, Chinese community has a long memory. You understand? I understand, Samuel said, and I respect your concern for your niece's welfare. Aunt Chen stepped forward and took Samuel's hands in both of hers, her grip surprisingly strong for such a small woman. You take care of our girl, she said, tears gathering in her eyes. She is a good girl, smart girl, but she is still young, still learning about the world. You are like father to her, protect her, help her become what she meant to be. Samuel felt the weight of her words settle over him like a mantle. I promise you, Mrs. Chen, I'll do everything in my power to help her succeed and keep her safe. May had been watching this exchange with an expression Samuel couldn't quite read. When her aunt released his hands, she stepped forward and bowed slightly to her uncle and aunt. I know you don't understand my choice, she said softly, but I hope someday you'll be proud of what I build with this opportunity. Chen's stern expression softened slightly. We are already proud of you, child. We just worry that pride is not enough to keep you safe in a world that is not always kind to Chinese people. I'll write to you, May promised, and I'll send money when I can to help with the business. You keep money for yourself, Aunt Chen said firmly. Build your future. Don't worry about old people who already have what they need. The emotional farewell was interrupted by the bell above the door as another customer entered. Chen immediately shifted back into business mode, but Samuel could see that the conversation had eased some of his concerns about the arrangement. I'll pick you up at dawn tomorrow, Samuel told May as they prepared to leave. Dress warm and pack light. We have a long ride ahead of us. May nodded. I'll be ready. As Samuel walked back toward the hotel, he found himself thinking about Aunt Chen's words about being like a father to May. It was a responsibility he had never expected to take on, but one that felt both weighty and oddly appropriate. At 35, he was old enough and experienced enough to serve as mentor and protector to a young woman finding her way in an unfamiliar world. But there was something else in the arrangement that went beyond paternal responsibility, something he wasn't ready to examine too closely yet. When May had looked him in the eye during their negotiations, when she had shown such practical intelligence, in thinking through the terms of their agreement, he had felt a stirring of attraction that had nothing to do with protective instincts. She was beautiful, despite the harsh haircut that had been intended to diminish her appeal. More than that, she was interesting, intelligent, courageous, and possessed of a quiet strength that reminded him why he had chosen the challenges of frontier life over the easier comforts of city living. But she was also vulnerable, dependent on his protection, and trusting him with her future in a way that made any romantic feelings seem inappropriate. The ethical thing to do was to focus on helping her build the skills and confidence she needed to eventually choose her own path, whether that led back to town, to marriage with someone else, or to some completely different future he couldn't yet imagine. If something more developed between them, it would have to grow naturally over time, after she had established her independence and proven to herself that she could succeed on her own terms. That evening, as Samuel sat in the hotel dining room, eating a meal of beef stew and fresh bread, he found himself both excited and nervous about the journey ahead. Tomorrow, he would begin the long ride back to Broken Arrow Ranch with a passenger who represented the biggest change in his routine since he had first claimed the land 15 years ago. He was gambling that May Chen had the strength and adaptability to thrive in the harsh but beautiful world he had built for himself. More than that, he was gambling that her presence might help him build something richer and more meaningful than the solitary success he had achieved through years of careful work and cautious living. Outside the hotel window, snow began falling again, soft and steady in the lamplight. By morning, there would be fresh drifts to navigate and new challenges to face. But for the first time in years, Samuel Hayes was looking forward to the journey ahead, eager to see how the addition of one determined young woman might change everything. He thought he knew about the life he had chosen to live. The journey to Broken Arrow Ranch took 3 days through mountain passes that tested both horse and rider. Samuel had loaded a sturdy wagon with winter supplies, but May insisted on riding horseback rather than bouncing over frozen ruts in the wagon bed. She had borrowed a side saddle from the livery stable and proven herself a competent rider, keeping pace despite the challenging terrain and bitter wind. They spent the first night at a roadhouse where the proprietor's wife took one look at May's cropped hair and assumed she was a boy traveling with his employer. Samuel didn't correct the misunderstanding, knowing it would make the sleeping arrangements simpler and spare May uncomfortable questions. She seemed grateful for the anonymity, pulling her hat low and speaking little during the evening meal. The second night they camped under the stars, building a fire against a sheltering rock face while their horses stamped and snorted in the cold. May proved surprisingly capable at outdoor tasks, helping to unsaddle the horses and gather firewood without being asked. When Samuel commented on her adaptability, she gave him a small smile. "My father was a farmer in Guangdong before he came to America," she said, stirring the pot of beans that would serve as their supper. "He taught me that work is work, whether it's done in a house or under the sky." It was the first personal information she had shared about her family, and Samuel filed it away as a small sign of growing trust between them. That night, sleeping on opposite sides of the fire with their saddles as pillows, he found himself listening to the sound of her breathing and wondering what dreams filled her sleep in this strange new chapter of her life. On the third morning, they crested the final ridge, and Broken Arrow Ranch spread below them like a promise fulfilled. 15,000 acres of valley floor stretched between protective mountain walls, the grassland now dormant under snow, but holding the memory of summer abundance. The ranch buildings clustered near a creek that would run silver with snowmelt come spring, their smoke-darkened chimneys sending straight columns into the still air. "It's beautiful," May said softly, and Samuel felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the sun breaking over the eastern peaks. The main house was a solid structure of hewn logs and native stone, built to last through decades of mountain winters. Samuel had designed it with an eye toward function rather than fashion, but he had also included details that spoke to his hope for eventual family life: wide porches for summer evenings, large windows to let in precious light, and rooms sized for more than one occupant. Behind the main house stood the barn, bunkhouse, and various outbuildings necessary for ranch operations, and 50 yards to the east, positioned to catch the morning sun, was the small cabin that would serve as May's quarters. Samuel had spent the previous month making improvements to it, adding better insulation, a larger window, and shelves that could serve as both storage and workspace. Jake Martinez, the foreman, emerged from the barn as they rode into the yard. A compact man with prematurely grey hair and intelligent eyes, he had worked for Samuel for 8 years and managed both the ranch operations and his employer's occasional bursts of impracticality with equal skill. His wife, Martha, appeared in the doorway of their cabin, drying her hands on her apron and studying the newcomer with frank curiosity. "Jake, Martha," Samuel called as they dismounted. "I'd like you to meet Miss May Chen. She'll be handling sewing and mending work for the ranch." Jake stepped forward with a slight bow, hat in hand. "Welcome to Broken Arrow, Miss Chen. I hope the journey wasn't too hard on you." May returned his greeting with a nod that managed to be both polite and reserved. "Thank you, Mr. Martinez. The journey was manageable, and the country is more beautiful than I expected." Martha approached with the direct manner of a woman accustomed to making quick judgments about people's character. "You look half frozen, dear. Come into our cabin and warm up while the men tend to the horses. I've got coffee on the stove and bread fresh from the oven." Samuel felt grateful for Martha's immediate acceptance and kindness. As the only woman on the ranch, she would play a crucial role in helping May adjust to her new circumstances. The 2 women disappeared into the foreman's cabin while Samuel and Jake unloaded the wagon and settled the horses. "She seems steady," Jake observed as they carried supplies into the barn. "Not what I expected when you said you were bringing back a seamstress from town." "What did you expect?" Jake grinned. "Someone older, maybe. Someone who looked like she'd spent her life darning socks instead of." He gestured in the direction of the cabin where the women had gone. "Well, instead of someone who rides like she was born to it and looks at this place like she's figuring out how to make it better." Samuel paused in stacking flour sacks. "You got all that from watching her for 10 minutes?" Martha got it too. She's already planning to teach Miss Chen how to preserve meat and tend a vegetable garden. Says any woman brave enough to come out here alone has the kind of backbone we can use. Over the following weeks, Jake's assessment proved accurate. May threw herself into ranch life with the determination of someone who understood that success depended on making herself indispensable. She established a workspace in her cabin that was part sewing room, part repair shop, and part small business enterprise. Within days, she had assessed every piece of fabric on the ranch and begun organizing repair projects by priority and complexity. The cabin itself was transformed under her care. Samuel had provided basic furniture and necessities, but May added touches that made it a home rather than just shelter. She sewed curtains from fabric she found in the supply closet, arranged her few possessions with careful attention to both beauty and function, and created small improvements that showed her growing investment in the space. Samuel found excuses to check on her progress, ostensibly to ensure she had everything needed for her work, but actually because he enjoyed watching her methodical approach to organizing her new life. She treated each task with the same careful attention she brought to mending torn cloth, thinking through problems thoroughly before acting. "The harness leather is in worse shape than you mentioned," she told him one morning as he delivered an armload of firewood to her cabin. "Some of it can be repaired, but several pieces need complete replacement. I can patch them temporarily, but you should order new gear before spring round up." Samuel set the wood beside her stove and accepted the cup of coffee she offered, noting how she had already learned his preference for it, strong and black. "I appreciate the assessment. Most people would just fix what was in front of them without thinking ahead to what might be needed." May shrugged, settling back to work on a bridle that had been damaged by a young horse's enthusiasm for chewing leather. It's more efficient to plan ahead than to be surprised by failures during busy seasons. This practical intelligence showed in everything she did. When she discovered that the ranch had been buying expensive thread and fabric from suppliers in Denver, she wrote letters to contacts in California who could provide the same materials at lower cost. When she noticed that Martha was struggling with a torn winter coat, she not only repaired it, but redesigned the closure system to make it more practical for ranch work. Most impressively, she began teaching herself skills that weren't part of her original job description. She convinced Jake to show her the basics of leather tooling, learned from Martha how to preserve and smoke meat, and studied Samuel's account books to understand the economics of ranch operations. "She's not planning to stay a seamstress forever," Martha observed one evening as she and Samuel watched May working with Jake to repair a broken wagon wheel. "That girl has bigger plans brewing in her head." Samuel nodded, feeling a mixture of admiration and concern. May's ambition and intelligence were exactly the qualities that had attracted him to hire her, but they also suggested that she was indeed treating this position as a stepping stone to something larger. He found himself hoping that whatever she built next might include a place for him, while trying not to let that hope influence how he treated her as an employee. The daily rhythms of winter ranch life provided a framework for their developing relationship. Samuel would check on the cattle and handle correspondence in his office. Jake would manage the practical details of feeding and maintenance. Martha would handle cooking and household management. And May would work steadily through the backlog of mending while taking on increasingly complex projects. Evenings brought them together in the main house, where they would share supper and spend the dark hours reading, playing cards, or simply talking by the fire. These gatherings felt natural rather than forced. Four people who had found a comfortable way to share each other's company during the long isolation of mountain winter. Samuel began to understand what had been missing from his solitary years. It wasn't just the presence of other people, but the sense of working toward shared goals with individuals whose skills complemented his own. May's attention to detail improved everyone's equipment and comfort. Martha's practical knowledge solved problems before they became crises. Jake's experience with cattle and horses freed Samuel to focus on the larger business decisions that shaped the ranch's future. But it was May's presence specifically that changed the quality of daily life in ways Samuel hadn't anticipated. She brought a different perspective to problems, asking questions that forced him to examine assumptions he had held for years. When he mentioned plans to expand the cattle operation, she asked about market conditions and transportation costs. When he discussed purchasing new equipment, she suggested modifications that would make it more practical for their specific needs. "You think like a business owner," he told her one evening as they reviewed supply lists for the coming year. "Not just someone doing a job, but someone who understands how all the pieces fit together." May looked up from the ledger she had been studying, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "I want to understand what makes a ranch successful. If I'm going to eventually run my own business, I need to learn from someone who has built something lasting." The reminder of her plans to leave eventually stung more than Samuel wanted to admit. Over the weeks since her arrival, he had begun to imagine a future that included her permanent presence, perhaps eventually as more than just an employee. But her comment reminded him that she was using this experience as education for her own independent future. "What kind of business are you thinking about?" he asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. "I'm not certain yet. Something that uses my skills with fabric and design, but on a larger scale than individual mending. Maybe a shop that specializes in work clothes for miners and ranchers, garments designed specifically for the demands of frontier life." Samuel could see the logic in this plan. Standard clothing from Eastern manufacturers often proved impractical. For Western work conditions, garments designed by someone who understood the actual requirements of ranch and mine work could command premium prices from people who valued function over fashion. "You'd need significant capital to start something like that," he observed. "Equipment inventory, a location in a town large enough to support the business." May nodded, closing the ledger with decisive motion. "Which is why this position is so valuable to me. The wages are good, but more importantly, I'm learning about business operations from someone who has succeeded at building something from nothing." Her honesty was both refreshing and painful. Samuel appreciated that she wasn't hiding her ultimate intentions, but he also felt like he was training his own replacement in some cosmic joke. Every skill he taught her, every aspect of ranch management she learned, brought her closer to the independence that would take her away from Broken Arrow. But as winter deepened and their partnership strengthened, Samuel began to see possibilities he hadn't considered before. What if May's eventual independence didn't have to mean leaving the ranch? What if there were ways to combine her business ambitions with the resources and opportunities that Broken Arrow could provide? The idea took firmer shape when a traveling salesman arrived in February, fighting through a late-season blizzard to reach the ranch with a wagon full of goods for the isolated community. Samuel invited the man to stay until the weather cleared, and during the long evening conversations, May peppered him with questions about markets, suppliers, and the challenges of running a business that served scattered rural customers. "The real money is in quality work," the salesman explained, warming his hands around a cup of coffee spiked with Samuel's best whiskey. "People out here will pay extra for goods that last, because getting replacements is such a challenge. But you have to build a reputation first, prove that your products are worth the premium price." "How do you build that reputation when you're starting from nothing?" May asked. "Start small, serve your local market perfectly, then let word spread. People talk to each other, especially in small communities. Do good work for the ranchers and miners in one area, and pretty soon you'll have customers riding 50 miles to buy from you." Samuel watched May absorb this information with the intensity of someone storing away every detail for future reference. After the salesman left, continuing his rounds with a wagon restocked from the ranch's supplies, she came to Samuel with a proposition that surprised him. "I've been thinking about what he said," she began, settling into the chair across from his desk where he handled ranch correspondence, "about building reputation through local service before expanding to larger markets." Samuel leaned back in his chair, curious about where this was leading. "Go on. What if I started that business here, at the ranch? Not immediately, but as a gradual expansion of the work I'm already doing. I could take on custom orders for other ranchers, design and produce specialty items that aren't available through normal suppliers." The idea was intriguing on multiple levels. It would allow May to build her business skills while remaining at Broken Arrow, and it could provide additional income for the ranch through workshop fees or profit sharing. Most importantly, it might offer a path that satisfied her ambitions without requiring her to leave. "What would you need to make something like that work?" Samuel asked. May had clearly thought this through in detail. "Better equipment, more space for cutting and assembly, access to a wider variety of materials, and I'd need your permission to market the ranch as a source for specialized work clothing and leather goods." Samuel felt excitement building as he considered the possibilities. We could convert part of the barn, set up a proper workshop with good light and ventilation. The ranch's reputation for quality could help establish credibility for your products. And I could continue handling regular ranch work while building the business gradually. Test designs, develop techniques, build a customer base without the pressure of immediate profitability. It was exactly the kind of careful, intelligent approach Samuel had come to expect from her, but it was also something more, a vision of the future that included both their goals, a way to build something together while respecting each other's independence. "I think it's a brilliant idea," he said. "We should start planning how to make it work." As spring approached and the snow began its slow retreat from the high country, Samuel found himself looking forward to the future in ways he hadn't felt since his early days of building the ranch. The partnership with May was evolving into something richer and more complex than a simple employer-employee relationship, but it was developing naturally, based on mutual respect and shared goals, rather than the desperate loneliness that had driven his previous attempt at marriage. Most importantly, May was choosing to build her future in ways that included him and the ranch, not because she had no other options, but because she saw genuine opportunity in their collaboration. It was exactly the kind of foundation that could support whatever might grow between them, whether that remained a business partnership or developed into something more personal. The winter that had begun with uncertainty and careful negotiations was ending with hope and expanding possibilities. Samuel Hayes had gambled on bringing a young Chinese woman to his isolated ranch, and that gamble was paying off in ways he never could have imagined. Spring came late to the Colorado Territory in 1894, but when it finally arrived, it brought more than melting snow and green grass. Word traveled fast along the mountain trails that connected isolated ranches to the broader world, and by May, news reached Broken Arrow Ranch that would test everything Samuel and May had built together. The first sign of trouble came with Tommy Fletcher, a young cowboy who rode for the Bar T Ranch 30 miles south. He arrived at dawn on a lathered horse, his face grim with the kind of news that couldn't wait for social niceties. "Sam," he called as Samuel emerged from the barn where he'd been checking on a mare ready to foal. "We got problems heading this way. Big problems." Samuel accepted the cup of coffee Martha pressed into his hands and settled onto the porch steps beside the exhausted rider. "What kind of problems, Tommy?" "Railroads coming through. Survey crew's been working the valley for 2 weeks now, marking out a route that cuts right through your north pasture and maybe half your water rights." Tommy gulped his coffee despite its scalding temperature. But that ain't the worst of it. Samuel felt ice forming in his stomach. The railroad had been rumored for years, but always through other valleys, other people's land. "What's the worst of it?" "Harrison Webb's behind it. Bought up options on every ranch between here and the main line, telling folks he's going to make them rich with right-of-way payments, but the contracts he's pushing give the railroad permanent rights to water and grazing, not just passage." Samuel knew Webb by reputation, a speculator from Denver who had made his fortune buying distressed properties and selling them to Eastern investors at inflated prices. He was smart, ruthless, and backed by railroad money that could overwhelm individual ranchers who tried to fight him in court. "How many have signed?" Samuel asked. "4 so far: Johnson, Peters, Old Man Brennan, and Miller. Webb's offering what sounds like good money up front, but Jake Martinez rode over to check the fine print on Johnson's contract. Near as we can tell, the railroad gets permanent water access and the right to bring in as much industrial development as they want." Samuel stood abruptly, pacing to the porch railing where he could look out over the valley that had been his life's work. 15 years of building, planning, and careful management could be wiped out by a railroad route that destroyed his water access and brought industrial development to pristine grazing land. "There's more," Tommy continued reluctantly. Webb's been asking questions about you specifically, about your household arrangements. The careful pause in Tommy's voice made Samuel's blood run cold. He turned back to the young cowboy with deadly calm. What kind of questions? About Miss Chen, about whether it's proper for an unmarried Chinese woman to be living alone with an unmarried white man. He's been suggesting to folks that maybe the territorial authorities ought to look into the situation, make sure everything's legal and proper. Samuel felt rage building in his chest like a forest fire. Webb was threatening to use May's vulnerable position as leverage against him, turning her courage and making a new life into a weapon to destroy what they had built together. The cabin. Doctor opened and May emerged, drawn by the urgency in their voices. She had been working on a complex repair to Samuel's good coat, and her fingers were still marked with chalk from making pattern adjustments. One look at Samuel's face told her that whatever news Tommy had brought was serious. "What's happening?" she asked quietly. Samuel explained Webb's railroad scheme and the threat it posed to the ranch, but he found himself reluctant to mention the personal attacks on her reputation. May listened with the focused attention she brought to all serious matters, asking practical questions about water rights, grazing contracts, and legal remedies. "And," she said when Samuel finished, clearly sensing there was more. Tommy looked uncomfortable, but May fixed him with a direct stare that demanded honesty. "Ma'am, this Webb fellow has been spreading talk about, well, about whether your living arrangements here are proper, suggesting that maybe the authorities ought to investigate." May's face went very still, but Samuel could see the anger burning behind her dark eyes. "I see. And what does he hope to accomplish with such talk?" "Pressure on Mr. Hayes, I reckon. Make him more willing to sell rather than fight a legal battle while also dealing with scandal." Samuel watched May process this information with the same methodical intelligence she applied to everything else. But he could also see the hurt beneath her composed exterior, the recognition that her race and gender made her an easy target for a man like Webb. "How long do we have before he expects an answer?" Samuel asked. "He's planning to visit every holdout ranch over the next 2 weeks. Figured he'd save Broken Arrow for last, since you got the most to lose and might be the hardest to convince." After Tommy left to carry the warning to other ranchers, Samuel found himself alone, with May on the porch, as the sun climbed higher over the mountain peaks. The morning that had started with routine ranch work had transformed into something that threatened everything they had built together. "I'm sorry," Samuel said finally. "I should have anticipated that someone might try to use your situation against us." May was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap as she gazed out. "Over the valley, I knew this might happen eventually," she said. "A Chinese woman living independently, especially in a place like this, draws attention. Some of it was bound to be hostile." "That doesn't make it right." "No, but it makes it predictable." She turned to face him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "The question is what we do about it." Samuel had been thinking about exactly that question since Tommy's revelation. The easy answer would be for May to return to Silver Falls until the crisis passed, removing Webb's ability to use her presence as a weapon. But that would mean abandoning everything they had worked to build, and it would reinforce the idea that she had no right to make her own choices about where and how to live. "I could marry you," Samuel said suddenly, the words emerging before he had fully thought them through. May's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That's a generous offer, but it would solve one problem by creating several others." "How do you figure?" "A hasty marriage to deflect gossip would convince people that the gossip was justified in the first place, and it would trap both of us in legal arrangements we haven't chosen freely." She paused, seeming to consider her words carefully. "Besides, marriage should be about building a life together because you want to, not because external pressures leave you no other choice." Samuel felt both relief and disappointment at her practical response. Relief because she was right about The problems such a marriage would create. Disappointment because some part of him had hoped she might want to take that step, regardless of the circumstances. "So, what do you suggest?" he asked. "We fight," May said simply. "We make it clear that I'm here by choice, that our arrangement is legal and proper, and that anyone who has problems with it can take them up with the territorial courts." Samuel admired her courage, but he also understood the practical limitations they faced. "May, fighting this could get ugly. Webb has money and connections, and there are plenty of people who would rather see Chinese families stay in Chinatowns rather than integrating into white communities. Then they need to learn that some Chinese people won't be confined to places others think appropriate for them." Her voice carried a steel that reminded Samuel why he had been drawn to her in the first place. "I didn't come this far just to run away when the first real challenge appeared." Over the following days, Samuel threw himself into researching their legal position and building alliances with neighboring ranchers who might be willing to stand against Webb's railroad scheme. He rode to meetings in schoolhouses and church basements, arguing that individual property rights were more important than railroad profits, that the development Webb promised would destroy the way of life that had drawn them all to the territory. May took a different approach. She intensified her work on custom orders for other ranches, making herself more valuable to the local community through the practical demonstration of her skills. When Mrs. Patterson needed a dress altered for her daughter's wedding, May completed the work in half the time and for less money than anyone else could have managed. When the Baptist minister tore his best coat on a fence post, she repaired it so skillfully that the mend was invisible. Most importantly, she began appearing at community gatherings where she had previously kept a low profile. At the monthly social at the Silver Falls Schoolhouse, she brought a selection of her work to display, showing the quality and range of her abilities. At the church picnic, she contributed a dish that combined Chinese cooking techniques with local ingredients, creating something that was both familiar and exotic. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of hiding from scrutiny, she was making it impossible for people to dismiss her as an outsider who contributed nothing to the community. Every rancher's wife who saw her needlework, every family who benefited from her skills, became a potential ally against Webb's personal attacks. But Webb proved to be a more formidable opponent than either of them had anticipated. When he finally arrived at Broken Arrow Ranch, he came not alone, but with two companions who represented the different types of pressure he was prepared to apply. The first was a lawyer from Denver, a thin man with pale eyes and a briefcase full of contracts that promised immediate payment in exchange for permanent concessions. The second was Deputy Marshal Frank Coombs, a federal officer who had the authority to investigate complaints about moral irregularities in territorial communities. Samuel met them in the yard between the main house and barn, with Jake Martinez standing silently at his side. May remained in her cabin, but Samuel knew she was watching through her window, assessing the threat these men represented to everything she had worked to build. "Mr. Hayes," Webb said with the false heartiness of a salesman, "I'm sure you've heard why we're here. The Colorado Mountain Railroad is prepared to make you a very generous offer for right-of-way access through your northern sections." Samuel accepted the contracts, but didn't open them. "And if I'm not interested in selling? Then the railroad will exercise its right of eminent domain and take the land anyway, but for considerably less compensation." Webb's smile never wavered. "Much better for everyone if we can reach a voluntary agreement." The lawyer stepped forward with his own folder of documents. "We've prepared everything necessary to make this transaction as painless as possible. Sign today and you'll have cash in hand by the end of the week." Samuel glanced at the deputy marshal, who had remained silent, but whose presence sent a clear message about the consequences of refusing Webb's offer. "And what's Deputy Coombs here to discuss?" Webb's expression grew serious as if he regretted having to raise uncomfortable topics. "Well, Sam, there have been some concerns raised about the propriety of your household arrangements. Nothing personal, you understand, but the territorial government has a responsibility to ensure that all communities maintain proper moral standards." Deputy Coombs finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. "I've received complaints about an unmarried Chinese woman living alone with an unmarried white man in circumstances that some consider improper. I'm required to investigate such complaints and take appropriate action if violations are found." Samuel felt the trap closing around him with mechanical precision. Accept the railroad deal and lose his water rights and grazing land. Refuse it and face legal harassment that could destroy both his reputation and May's safety. Webb had engineered a situation where any choice Samuel made would cost him something essential. "What exactly are you alleging?" Samuel asked carefully. "Nothing specific," Webb said quickly, "but you have to understand how it looks to decent people. A young Chinese woman living alone with a white man, no family supervision, no proper marriage arrangements. It raises questions about what kind of relationship really exists between you." "The kind of relationship that's none of your business," Samuel replied, his temper beginning to show despite his efforts to remain calm. Deputy Coombs consulted a small notebook. "According to my information, this woman has been living on your ranch for months without proper chaperoning or legal marriage. Under territorial moral conduct statutes, that could constitute cohabitation, which is a criminal offense. She has her own separate living quarters and works as my employee under a legal contract witnessed by Reverend Morrison," Samuel said. "If you're suggesting something improper is happening, you'll need evidence, not gossip from land speculators." Webb held up his hands as if trying to calm a dangerous situation. "And nobody wants to see anyone get hurt, Sam. But you have to admit that your situation is unusual. Might be better for everyone if the young lady returned to her own people while you sort out your land difficulties." The suggestion was delivered with false concern, but Samuel heard the threat underneath. Sell the land, or watch May be driven away by legal harassment that could escalate into criminal charges based on nothing more than racial prejudice and malicious gossip. "I'll need time to consider your offer," Samuel said finally. "Of course," Webb replied, "but don't take too long. The railroad has schedules to meet, and moral concerns have a way of growing more serious the longer they're left unaddressed." After the three men left, Samuel found May in her cabin, calmly continuing work on a leather vest that required intricate stitching. Her composure was remarkable, but he could see the tension in her shoulders and the careful way she was controlling her breathing. "How much did you hear?" he asked. "Enough to understand that Mr. Webb is more dangerous than we anticipated." She set aside her work and looked up at him with dark eyes that held both fear and determination. "He's not just threatening your land, he's threatening my freedom. If he can convince the authorities that our arrangement is immoral, they could force me to leave the territory entirely." Samuel sat heavily in the chair across from her small table. "I won't let that happen. You may not have a choice. If Deputy Coombs decides to pursue charges, you could face criminal penalties for cohabitation, and I could be deported back to China as an undesirable alien." The casual way she stated these terrifying possibilities told Samuel that she had already thought through all the implications of their situation. Webb wasn't just using racial prejudice as leverage. He was threatening to destroy both their lives. If they refused to submit to his demands, "There has to be another way," Samuel said. May picked up her needle again, but didn't resume stitching. "There is. We could get married, legitimately and by choice, not as a desperate response to threats." Samuel looked at her carefully, trying to read her expression. "Is that what you want?" "I want to build something meaningful with my life, something that lasts and matters." Over the past months, I've come to believe that might be possible here. With you in ways it wouldn't be anywhere else. She met his eyes steadily. But not because we're forced into it by men like Webb. Because we choose it freely as equal partners who respect each other. Samuel felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than practical arrangements or defensive strategies. May, I've been falling in love with you since the day you walked into that laundry with your chin up, despite everything that had been done to you. But I didn't want to say anything while you were still figuring out your own path. And I've been falling in love with the life we've built together, she replied. Not just the work or the ranch, but the way we solve problems together, the way we make each other stronger. They looked at each other across the small table, both understanding that they were at a moment that would define the rest of their lives. Webb's threats had forced them to confront feelings they might have continued circling around for months, but the decision they made would be their own. If we do this, Samuel said slowly, it has to be because we want to build a future together, not because we're running from Webb's threats. Agreed, May said. But we also can't ignore the fact that marriage would remove his ability to use our relationship as a weapon against us. Samuel reached across the table and took her hands in his. They were small but strong, marked by the countless hours of careful work that had made her indispensable to the ranch, and to his own growing vision of what their shared future might look like. May Chen, he said formally, will you marry me? Not to solve our problems, but because I believe we can build something beautiful together. She smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her since Tommy Fletcher's arrival had turned their world upside down. Yes, Samuel Hayes, I will marry you because I choose to, and because I believe in what we can build together. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the mountain peaks, promising the kind of late spring weather that could bring either gentle rain or destructive hail. But inside the small cabin, two people who had found each other across vast distances of culture and circumstance were planning a future that no land speculator or railroad company could take away from them. Samuel and May had planned a simple wedding ceremony for the following Saturday, with Reverend Morrison officiating and the Martinez family as witnesses. But Harrison Webb had other plans, and he struck before they could formalize their union and remove his most effective weapon against them. The attack came at dawn on Thursday, not with legal papers or railroad surveyors, but with violence that shattered the mountain silence like breaking glass. Samuel woke to the sound of horses thundering into the ranch yard and men shouting orders with military precision. Through his bedroom window, he saw 6 riders surrounding the main house while 2 more headed toward May's cabin. He grabbed his rifle and boots, moving with the speed of a man who had learned frontier survival the hard way. But as he reached for his door, a voice called out from the yard with the authority of federal law. Samuel Hayes! This is Deputy Marshal Coombs. You're under arrest for violation of territorial moral conduct statutes. Come out with your hands visible and no weapons. Samuel's blood turned to ice water. Webb hadn't waited for legal proceedings or community pressure. He had convinced Coombs to make arrests based on nothing more than malicious accusations, striking when Samuel and May were most vulnerable. Through the thin cabin walls, he could hear May's voice raised in protest as the men forced their way into her quarters. The sound of her resistance turned his fear into rage that threatened to overwhelm his judgment. But charging out with a rifle would only give them excuse to use deadly force against both of them. I'm coming out, he called, setting his rifle aside and opening the door with his hands raised. Coombs sat his horse with the cold satisfaction of a man executing an unpleasant but necessary duty. Behind him, Samuel recognized 2 of Webb's associates, and 3 men he didn't know who had the hard look of professional gunfighters, dressed as deputy marshals. Samuel Hayes, Coombs announced formally, you're under arrest for unlawful cohabitation in violation of Territorial Statute 247. You have the right to legal representation, but you'll be held in custody until trial. On what evidence? Samuel demanded, even as two men moved to flank him with drawn weapons. Testimony from reliable witnesses that you've been living in immoral circumstances with a Chinese woman for over 6 months. Coombs consulted his notebook with bureaucratic precision. The woman will be held separately pending determination of her legal status in the territory. Samuel felt the trap snap shut with mechanical finality. Webb had found witnesses willing to swear they had observed improper conduct, probably paying them enough to overcome any scruples about perjury. Without marriage certificates or other legal protection, Samuel and May were vulnerable to whatever charges corrupt officials chose to bring. The cabin door opened and May emerged between two men who held her arms with unnecessary roughness. Her face was composed, but Samuel could see the fear in her dark eyes and the way she held herself rigidly upright against the humiliation of being manhandled by strangers. "Miss Chen," Coombs continued, "you're being detained pending investigation of your immigration status and possible deportation proceedings. You'll be held in protective custody until proper arrangements can be made." "Protective custody," May repeated with bitter precision. "Is that what you call kidnapping a woman from her home based on lies and prejudice?" One of the men holding her arms tightened his grip warningly, but she didn't flinch. Samuel had never been prouder of her courage or more terrified for her safety. "Where are you taking us?" Samuel asked. "You'll be held in Silver Falls pending trial. The woman will be transferred to Denver for processing by immigration authorities." Coombs folded his notebook with the satisfaction of a job completed. "If you're both as innocent as you claim, the legal system will sort everything out properly." Samuel knew better than to believe such promises. Once May was in federal custody in Denver, Webb's money and influence could ensure she disappeared into the immigration system and was deported before Samuel could mount any legal defense. This wasn't law enforcement, it was kidnapping sanctioned by corrupt officials. But as the men moved to bind his hands, salvation came from an unexpected direction. The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of Jake Martinez, leading a group of mounted men who surrounded Coombs' party with the practiced efficiency of experienced fighters. Samuel recognized most of them, ranchers and cowhands, from neighboring spreads who had been meeting secretly to coordinate resistance against Webb's railroad scheme. But they had arrived armed and organized like a military unit, not a spontaneous rescue party. "Deputy Coombs," Jake called out with deadly calm, "I think you'd better reconsider what you're doing here." Coombs reached for his sidearm, but found himself looking down the barrels of a dozen rifles held by men who clearly knew how to use them. His backup hesitated, realizing they were outnumbered and outgunned by people who had more reason to fight than they did. "This is interference with a federal law enforcement operation," Coombs blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. "This is citizens protecting their neighbors from false arrest based on perjured testimony," replied Tom Bradley, whose ranch bordered Samuel's southern boundary. "We know what Webb's been up to, and we know what kind of witnesses he's been buying." Samuel felt a surge of hope mixed with concern for his neighbor's safety. They were risking federal charges by interfering with what appeared to be a legitimate arrest, but they were also his only chance to prevent Webb from destroying everything he and May had built. "Jake," he called out, "how did you know?" "Martha saw them coming and rode hard to spread the word. We've been ready for something like this since Webb started making his threats." Jake kept his rifle trained on Coombs while he spoke. "Amazing how many people had sudden moral concerns about your household after Webb started spreading his money around town. One of Webb's hired guns shifted his position slightly, and 3 ranchers immediately adjusted their aim in response. The message was clear. Any violence would be met with overwhelming force from people who had nothing left to lose. "Deputy Coombs," said a new voice from the edge of the group, "I think we need to discuss the legal situation here." Samuel turned to see Reverend Morrison approaching on horseback, dressed in his formal clerical robes and carrying a leather portfolio that suggested official business. "Reverend," Coombs acknowledged warily, "this is a law enforcement matter, not a church concern." "Actually, it's very much a church concern," Morrison replied with serene confidence. "You see, I have here the marriage certificate for Samuel Hayes and Mei Chen, properly witnessed and filed with territorial authorities 3 days ago." Samuel's jaw dropped. He and May had planned their wedding for Saturday, not Wednesday, but Morrison was producing official-looking documents from his portfolio with the calm authority of a man stating simple facts. "That's impossible," Coombs sputtered. "They weren't married when I received my complaint. According to these documents, they were married in a private ceremony on Monday evening, with Jake and Martha Martinez serving as witnesses." Morrison handed the papers to Coombs with beatific calm. "I apologize for not announcing it publicly, but they requested discretion due to concerns about racial prejudice in some quarters of the community." Samuel caught Jake's eye and saw a barely suppressed grin. Somehow, his friends had anticipated Webb's legal assault and prepared a defense that turned his accusations into irrelevant gossip about a legally married couple. Coombs examined the documents with growing frustration. Whatever else he might be, he wasn't stupid enough to proceed with arrests for unlawful cohabitation when presented with what appeared to be legitimate marriage certificates. "Even if this is genuine," he said finally, "there are still questions about the woman's immigration status and right to remain in the territory." "Actually," Morrison continued with the same serene confidence, "marriage to a U.S. citizen grants Mrs. Hayes immediate legal residency status. I have the federal guidelines right here, if you'd like to review them." The trap that Webb had so carefully constructed was collapsing around Coombs like a house built on sand. Every legal justification for the arrests had been systematically demolished by documents that appeared completely legitimate. But Samuel knew Webb wouldn't give up so easily. The man had too much invested in acquiring Broken Arrow Ranch to be deterred by one setback, no matter how complete it appeared. "This doesn't end the railroad matter," Coombs said, grasping for some way to salvage the situation. "The Colorado Mountain Railroad still has legal authority to acquire necessary right-of-way through eminent domain proceedings." "That's true," Tom Bradley acknowledged. "But it'll be a lot harder to justify taking a legally married couple's homestead than it would have been to steal land from a man living in alleged sin." Samuel realized that his friends had bought him time and legal protection, but they had also escalated the conflict in ways that could have serious consequences. Webb wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat gracefully, especially when his business reputation was at stake. "Jake," he said quietly, "we need to talk about what happens next." The confrontation ended with Coombs and his men retreating to Silver Falls, but everyone understood it was a temporary victory. Webb still had railroad backing, federal connections, and enough money to find other ways to pressure Samuel into selling his land. As the dust settled, Samuel found himself alone, with May for the first time since the crisis began. She stood beside her cabin, still shaken but unbowed, watching their neighbors disperse with the grim satisfaction of a battle won, but not a war concluded. "Are we really married?" she asked quietly. Samuel looked at Reverend Morrison, who was carefully packing his portfolio with documents that had appeared at exactly the right moment to save them from Webb's trap. "That depends," the Reverend said with a slight smile, "on whether you want to be. The documents I showed Deputy Coombs are, shall we say, prepared in advance of the ceremony you had planned for Saturday, but they could be made retroactively accurate if you choose to exchange vows right now." Samuel turned to May with a question in his eyes. Everything had happened so fast that they hadn't had time to process the emotional implications of what their friends had done to protect them. "I know this isn't how we planned it," he said. "If you want to wait until Saturday until we can do this properly." May stepped forward and took his hands in hers. "Samuel Hayes, nothing about our relationship has followed conventional patterns. Why should our wedding be different?" She was right. From their first meeting in the laundry, to their partnership at the ranch, to this moment of crisis and salvation, they had written their own rules and made their own choices. A wedding ceremony performed in the aftermath of a failed arrest, witnessed by armed neighbors who had risked everything to protect them, seemed perfectly appropriate for the life they were building together. "Do you, Samuel Hayes, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Morrison asked with formal dignity that transformed the chaotic morning into something sacred. "I do," Samuel replied, looking into May's dark eyes and seeing his future reflected there. "And do you, Machen, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," she said firmly, her voice carrying across the ranch yard like a declaration of independence. "Then, by the authority vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I pronounce you husband and wife." Samuel kissed his bride, while their friends cheered and the mountain peaks stood witness to vows that had been tested by fire before they were even spoken. It wasn't the wedding either of them had imagined, but it was perfectly suited to the unconventional love story they were writing together. But even as they celebrated, Samuel knew that Webb wasn't finished. The railroad speculator had lost this battle, but he had too much invested to abandon his plans for Broken Arrow Ranch. The real test of their marriage would come in the days ahead, when Webb regrouped and attacked with methods that legal documents couldn't defend against. That evening, as Samuel and May sat on the porch of the main house as husband and wife, they could see smoke rising from fires in the hills, signal fires that suggested Webb's men were positioning for something more than legal harassment. "He'll come back," May said quietly, her head resting against Samuel's shoulder. "I know, but when he does, he'll be facing more than just one man protecting his ranch. He'll be facing a community that's decided to stand together against outside threats." May was quiet for a moment, then smiled with the dangerous satisfaction of a woman who had found her place in the world and was prepared to defend it. "Good," she said. "I've been looking forward to showing Mr. Webb what happens when he threatens my family." Samuel tightened his arm around his wife, feeling the truth of her words settle into his bones. They were no longer just two individuals trying to build separate futures. They were a family, part of a community, backed by neighbors who valued loyalty over profit and courage over convenience. Whatever Webb brought against them next, they would face it together. Webb's final gambit came not with legal papers or hired guns, but with fire. 3 days after the failed arrests, smoke began rising from strategic points across the valley. Not the controlled burns ranchers used to manage grassland, but the angry orange glow of structures deliberately set. Ablaze, Samuel woke to Jake's urgent pounding on the main house door. Through the pre-dawn darkness, they could see flames consuming the line cabin at the northern boundary of Broken Arrow Ranch. And beyond that, similar fires marked the locations of Bradley's equipment shed and Miller's hay barn. "He's trying to force us all to sell by making it too expensive to stay," Jake said grimly as he saddled his horse. "Burn down enough infrastructure, and rebuilding costs more than most folks can afford." But Webb had miscalculated the character of the people he was fighting. Instead of cowering in their homes, waiting for the next attack, the ranchers of the valley responded with the coordinated fury of a community pushed beyond endurance. By full daylight, 40 mounted men had converged on Broken Arrow Ranch, armed and organized like a military expedition. They weren't just defending individual properties anymore. They were defending a way of life that Webb's railroad development would destroy forever. "Time to end this," Tom Bradley announced. checking the action on his rifle. Webb's holed up at the old Thompson place with his hired men, thinking we'll negotiate now that he's shown what he can do to our property. Samuel felt the weight of leadership settling on his shoulders. These men had rallied to defend his ranch first, making him the natural focal point for their resistance. But he also understood that the next few hours would determine whether they remained a community of independent ranchers or became employees of the Colorado Mountain Railroad. "Before we ride out," he said, addressing the assembled group, "I want everyone to understand what we're risking. If we confront Webb directly, there's no going back. The territorial authorities will either support us or brand us as vigilantes. They already made their choice when they sent crooked deputies to arrest you on false charges," replied Jim Patterson, whose weathered face showed the accumulated anger of months of pressure from railroad speculators. "Webb's shown he doesn't respect law or property rights. We showed him what frontier justice looks like." May emerged from the house carrying Samuel's rifle and cartridge belt, her face set with determination that matched the men around her. She had braided her hair into a practical arrangement and dressed in the divided riding skirt she wore for ranch work. "I'm coming with you," she announced, ignoring the surprised murmurs from some of the ranchers who weren't accustomed to women. "Joining armed expeditions." "May," Samuel began, but she cut him off with a look that brooked no argument. "Webb made this personal when he tried to have me deported as an undesirable alien. I have as much right as anyone to face the man who threatened my family." Jake nodded approvingly. "She can shoot better than half these men, and she knows this country as well as any of us now. We can use every good hand we can get." The ride to the Thompson place took 2 hours through the country that told the story of Webb's campaign of intimidation. They passed burned fence posts, poisoned water holes, and cattle scattered by night riders who had systematically undermined ranch operations throughout the valley. But they also passed signs of community resistance, neighbors helping neighbors rebuild, shared resources keeping struggling operations afloat, and the kind of mutual support that had enabled settlement of the frontier in the first place. The Thompson Ranch sat in a defensible position between two hills, chosen by the original owner, for protection against Indian raids that were no longer a threat. Webb had turned it into a fortress, with guards posted at strategic points and enough supplies to withstand a siege. Samuel led his force to a position overlooking the main buildings, studying the layout through field glasses, while Jake counted armed men and noted defensive positions. Webb had perhaps 20 hired guns, professional fighters who would be dangerous in a direct assault, but were fighting for pay rather than principle. "We could take them," Jake observed, "but it would cost us men we can't spare." Samuel nodded, but his attention was focused on something else. Webb himself was visible on the ranch house porch, pacing back and forth with the agitated energy of a man watching his carefully constructed plans falling apart. "I'm going to talk to him," Samuel announced, lowering the field glasses. "Sam, that's suicide," Tom Bradley protested. "He's got sharpshooters positioned to cover every approach." "Not if I go under a flag of truce. Even Webb won't risk shooting down an unarmed negotiator in front of witnesses." May caught his arm as he prepared to mount his horse. "If you're going, I'm going with you." Samuel started to protest, but then he saw the strategic wisdom in her suggestion. Webb had made her a target of his attacks, and her presence would force him to justify his actions to the community members who were watching from the surrounding hills. They rode toward the ranch house slowly, Samuel carrying a white cloth tied to a rifle barrel, while May sat her horse with the dignified composure of a woman who belonged exactly where she was. The hired guards tracked them with rifle barrels, but nobody fired. Webb emerged from the house as they approached, flanked by 2 gunmen who kept their weapons visible, but not directly threatening. Close up, Samuel could see that the railroad speculator was showing strain from weeks of escalating conflict that hadn't proceeded according to his plans. Hayes, Webb called out when they were close enough for conversation. Come to talk sense finally. Come to give you one last chance to leave the valley peacefully, Samuel replied, dismounting but staying close enough to his horse for a quick escape if necessary. Webb laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're hardly in a position to make demands. I've got 20 armed men and railroad backing worth more money than this entire valley will produce in 10 years. And I've got 40 neighbors who are tired of being pushed around by outside interests, Samuel countered. Men who've decided they'd rather fight than sell their heritage to a railroad that'll strip mine the valley and move on when the profits run out. Heritage, Webb sneered. You've been here 15 years, Hayes. That's barely long enough to prove up a homestead claim, much less establish any kind of heritage worth defending. May stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. Mr. Webb, you seem to misunderstand what heritage means. It's not about how long your family has occupied a place, but about what you've built there and what you're willing to sacrifice to protect it. Webb's attention shifted to her with the predatory focus of a man who had found a weak point to attack. Mrs. Hayes, if that's really what you are now. Convenient marriage, wasn't it? Just in time to avoid deportation. Proceedings. Convenient for you to attack a woman's reputation when your business schemes aren't proceeding as planned, May replied with acid sweetness. But then, men who resort to arson and false arrests probably aren't concerned with honor in their business dealings. Samuel watched Webb's face flush with anger and realized that May had identified the speculator's greatest weakness, his pride in his own cleverness. Webb had spent months orchestrating elaborate schemes to pressure individual ranchers into selling, but those schemes had been defeated by simple community solidarity. Here's what's going to happen, Samuel said, pressing the advantage. You and your hired men are going to pack up and leave the valley today. You're going to tell the railroad that right-of-way through here isn't available at any price, and you're going to find some other route for your development plans. And if I refuse? Webb asked, though his bluster sounded forced. Then 40 armed men are going to escort you to the territorial border, and you'll be advised that returning would be hazardous to your health. Samuel let his hand rest casually on his gun belt. We've had enough of outside interests trying to steal what we've built. Webb looked around at the hills surrounding his temporary stronghold, where the glint of sunlight on rifle barrels made it clear that Samuel's threat wasn't empty. The hired guns he had brought were professionals, but they were also businessmen who understood when a contract had become too dangerous to fulfill. You're making a mistake, Hayes, Webb said finally. The railroad will come through here eventually, with or without local cooperation. Fighting progress just makes it more expensive for everyone involved. Maybe, Samuel acknowledged, but it won't be your railroad, and it won't be on terms that destroy the community that's grown up here. If development comes, it'll come through negotiation with people who actually live here, not schemes cooked up by speculators in Denver. The standoff stretched for several more minutes, but Samuel could see that Webb was calculating odds and finding them unfavorable. The railroad backing he had claimed was contingent on acquiring land cheaply, and prolonged conflict would make the entire project too expensive to justify. I'll consider your suggestion, Webb said finally. But this conversation is far from over. Yes, it is, May said quietly. You've shown this community who you really are, Mr. Webb, a man who threatens women and burns other people's property when he can't get his way through honest dealing. Even if you convince some railroad to continue this project, you won't be welcome to oversee it personally. Webb's face went white with rage, but before he could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced new arrivals to the confrontation. Samuel turned to see Deputy Marshal Coombs leading a small group of federal officers up the valley, their uniforms suggesting official business rather than Webb's bought-and-paid-for harassment. But these weren't the same men who had attempted the fraudulent arrests 3 days earlier. The lead rider wore the insignia of a territorial marshal, and his bearing suggested someone who took federal law seriously rather than treating it as a tool for private interests. "Marshal Davidson," Webb called out with visible relief. "Thank God you've arrived. These people are threatening federal officers and interfering with legitimate railroad development." Marshal Davidson ignored Webb's appeal and rode directly to Samuel and May, studying them with the professional assessment of a man accustomed to sorting truth from lies in frontier disputes. "Mr. Hayes, I'm Marshal Davidson, sent by the Territorial Governor to investigate complaints about irregularities in federal law enforcement activities in this district." He glanced toward Webb with obvious distaste. "Deputy Coombs has been suspended pending a full investigation into allegations of corruption and abuse of authority." Samuel felt a surge of hope mixed with wariness. Federal intervention could resolve their immediate crisis, but it could also bring complications they hadn't anticipated. "Marshal," he said carefully, "we're just protecting our property and families from harassment by outside interests who don't respect local law or community standards." "So I understand. The territorial governor has received numerous complaints about intimidation tactics, arson, and fraudulent legal proceedings connected to railroad development schemes." Davidson consulted a notebook similar to the one Coombs had carried, but his manner suggested genuine law enforcement rather than purchased results. "I'm here to restore proper legal authority and ensure that any future development proceeds through legitimate channels." The confrontation that had been building toward violence was defused by the arrival of actual federal authority interested in justice rather than profit. Webb found himself facing investigation for the very corruption he had thought would protect him, while the ranchers who had organized to resist his schemes were officially recognized as defending their legitimate rights. Over the following weeks, the legal aftermath sorted itself out with surprising swiftness. Webb fled the territory ahead of fraud charges, his hired guns scattered to find employment with less controversial employers, and the Colorado Mountain Railroad quietly canceled its development plans for the valley. But for Samuel and May, the real victory was quieter and more personal. They had faced the greatest threat to everything they had built together, and they had emerged stronger both as individuals and as a married couple deeply rooted in a community that accepted them completely. On a warm evening in late summer, they sat on the porch of the main house, watching the sun set behind the mountain peaks that had witnessed their entire courtship. May's sewing business had expanded beyond individual ranch work to supplying specialty clothing for mining companies throughout the territory. Samuel's cattle operation had grown to take advantage of grazing land abandoned by ranchers who had sold out to Webb before his schemes collapsed. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had refused your original job offer?" May asked, her hand resting in his as they watched their neighbor's distant lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness. Samuel considered the question seriously. "I think I would have kept bringing shirts to that laundry until I found some other excuse to convince you to take a chance on building something together." May laughed, the sound carrying across the valley like music. "You were that determined?" "I was that sure that we belonged together," Samuel corrected. "From the moment you walked into that front room with your chin up, despite everything that had been done to you, I knew you had the kind of strength that could thrive here." They sat in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared overhead. Two people who had found in each other the perfect partner for building a life that honored both their individual dreams and their shared commitment to something larger than themselves. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and the sound was answered from across the valley where other families were settling in for the night. In homes they had built with their own hands on land, they had earned the right to call their own. Samuel Hayes and Machen Hayes had written their own love story in the wilderness of Colorado Territory, and it was exactly the story they had chosen to live. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.